You're watching BBC News. Breaking news this hour. Israel's defense minister says it's launched a preemptive attack against Iran. Israel Katz declared a special and permanent state of emergency in all areas of Iran and closed the country's airspace. An Israeli defense official says the attack has been coordinated with the US and had been planned for months. Smoke can be seen coming from buildings in Tehran, and people have reportedly been running away in panic there. Mehrabad airport just outside Tehran has also come under attack. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei is said to not be in Tehran. The US embassy in Israel in Israel said the attack follows weeks of tensions in the region, with the US forces massing around Iran and President Trump threatening to attack unless it agrees to dismantle its nuclear program. Well, let's now speak to the International Crisis Group's Iran Project Director, Ali Vaez, who joins us from Geneva. Thank you for joining us on BBC News. A lot of people had been expecting an attack like this. What we're hearing from an Israeli defense official is that the operation had been planned months ago and a date had been decided weeks ago. Does that surprise you?
Not really, but it is going to have a very negative impact on the perceptions about the reliability of the United States as a negotiating partner. Because the U.S. was engaged once again in a redux of 2025 in negotiations with Iran. Another round was scheduled for Monday, and now it appears that diplomacy was once again used as a cover for war.
Do we have a sense of what the goal, what the objective could be for any military strike at the moment?
Look, first of all, if this is framed as a preventative war or a preemptive war, it doesn't make any sense, because President Trump, after the 12-day war in June of 2025, said that the Iranian nuclear program was completely obliterated. Prime Minister Netanyahu said that Iran's missile program was set back in a very significant way. If President Trump wanted to claim that he was going to the rescue of the Iranian protesters, well, the Iranian regime committed a bloody massacre and crushed those protests. So it's really unclear what was being prevented, what was being preempted. But one thing is clear. I think this is an attempt at trying to dismantle the Iranian regime. If the initial reports are accurate, that the area that has been targeted is in downtown Tehran, in the Pastor area, which houses the office of the Supreme Leader, the office of the Supreme National Security Council, the presidency, and a lot of other important government offices. It does appear that this is really a decapitation attempt and trying to get rid of the Islamic Republic.
And what we're hearing from Iran is that Ayatollah Khamenei is not in Tehran this morning there. What kind of response could we see from the Iranian government?
Well, look, unlike last year, the Iranians have been anticipating this strike. So there is no element of surprise. And they were preparing for a very harsh response. The calculus there is that, last year they responded against Israel in a significant way and caused a lot of damage on Israeli territory. But in response to the United States, they were much more cautious. They struck a U.S. base in Qatar, but there were no American fatalities. And the conclusion in Tehran was that this Iranian restraint was interpreted by the Americans as weakness and is only going to invite more aggression. That is why they were going to respond in a harsh way, trying to spill American blood and inflict even more harm on Israel in order to restore a degree of deterrence. So I do think that we should anticipate a very harsh Iranian response, which could turn this conflict into a regional conflagration with disastrous implications for all.
We saw Iran carry out military exercises in the Strait of Hormuz during the midst of those discussions. with the United States. As you mentioned, there was that strike it carried out on a military airbase, US military airbase in Qatar. Just talk to us about what Iran could potentially do in retaliation.
So, since Israel is the aggressor here and has started this war, I think we can anticipate hundreds of missiles, Iranian ballistic missiles, supersonic missiles, targeting Israel in the next few minutes or hours. That's step number one. If the U.S. has indeed been involved by firing cruise missiles, then I think it is very likely that the Iranians would target U.S. naval assets in the region. It is also possible that Iran would target U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. And if this crisis escalates further and Israel and the U.S. target Iranian infrastructure, energy infrastructure or other infrastructure, then you can expect that the Iranians would target gas fields or energy infrastructure in the region, U.S. bases in the Gulf, and also put pressure on oil exports and energy exports out of the Persian Gulf. And then finally, if it becomes an existential battle for the Islamic Republic, one can anticipate that the remnants of Iranian network of proxies in the region would also join in. So you would have Hezbollah started firing missiles towards Israel. You would have the Houthis in Yemen putting pressure on free flow of commerce out of the Red Sea and the Bab al-Mandab. And finally, you might even have the Iraqi militias who so far have stood aside jump into this conflict again for their own, because everybody sees it as an existential battle for their own sake.
Ali, I just want to interrupt you just for a second to bring this breaking news coming into us from the Reuters news agency. A US official confirming to them that US strikes on Iran are now underway. So we've been following these Israeli strikes on Iran, but now confirmation from the US that its own strikes on Iran are now underway. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it was, as I said, it's not surprising that the U.S. is involved. The U.S. has amassed enormous firepower around Iran, unlike in last year's war, where it had to fly its B-2 bombers all the way from U.S. territory, U.S. soil, for 36 hours to bomb Iran for 45 minutes. This also indicates that the U.S. is prepared for a much more sustained and extensive military campaign. So this is unlikely to be a matter of a few hours or maybe a few days. It might be a long, multi-week bombing campaign, which, again, as I said, could escalate very quickly. And also, we have to remember the implication. This is the second time that in the middle of the negotiations, the U.S. has bombed Iran. That means that the value of diplomacy with the United States, I think, would completely vanish in the minds of the Iranians.
We had been preparing for strikes like this to happen, but the question still remains, what is the goal of strikes like this? There hasn't been a real conversation, perhaps, about what a future Iran could look like. Is this a short-term strike? What will be the impact of that on Iranians and on the region? The fact that we haven't had that extensive conversation, how concerning is that for you?
It is very concerning because this is a war in search of a strategy, in search of an objective. Reality is that, again, if you look at the rhetoric from Washington and Jerusalem after last year's war, it was full victory, that all the objectives were achieved. Iran's nuclear program was set back, Iran's missile program was degraded, and it appeared that the problem was put in the back burner for a long period of time. And yet we're at it again in 8 months. This time around, I think it really boils down to a simple fact. Israel and the US saw an opportunity in Iran being relatively weak and want to finish the job that was not finished last year. It is also important to note that based on international law, this is illegal. Based on US law, this is illegal because President Trump had to go to Congress to explain what are the objectives, why he believes that he needs to go to war with Iran again, and get authorization. None of this has happened. There's been no serious policy debate about this in the United States, and yet we're in the middle of another war, which could cost American lives and have implications for the region and beyond for another generation.
We saw during the negotiations that had been happening, the US and Israel raising concerns about Iran's nuclear program, its ballistics program, as well as, and also its support of proxy groups in the region. Do you think Iran could have compromised on those points with the US and Israel?
Look, it was unrealistic to expect Iran to capitulate to all of the US demands at the negotiating table. But as the foreign minister of Oman, who was in Washington yesterday and had a meeting with Vice President Vance and did engagement with the press in the US, explained, they were making good progress. I do believe that the Iranians should have been more flexible, but I also do believe that diplomacy needed a little bit more time, and there was a solution available that was much less costly for all sides than engaging in a risky gambit of war, hoping that it would result in any kind of soft landing and a better situation. Look, these wars, especially when they cause a high number of civilian casualties, they also create instability, radicalization, terrorism, and the implications, again, could go well beyond the short-termism that we're all focused on. And at the end of the day, there is a tension between the rhetoric from Washington and Jerusalem and saying that Iran was weakened significantly, and yet there was such an imminent threat that it required another preemptive or preventative war against Iran.
Ali Vaez, Iran Project Director at the International Crisis Group, thank you for joining us on BBC News.
My pleasure.
Well, let's go to Jerusalem now and speak to our correspondent there, John Donaldson. John, what's the latest there?
Well, let's just recap the morning here. About, 40 minutes ago now, we awoke to the sound of sirens going off across Jerusalem and across Israel. This was apparently an initial warning, I suppose, to expect some sort of retaliation in the coming hours and days from the Iranians. We've had this statement from Israel's Defense Minister, Israel Katz, saying that a state of emergency has been declared across the country because Israel has carried out what he called a preemptive strike against Iran. Now, the Israeli media is reporting that this was a joint operation between the United States and the Israelis, and I've just seen an Israeli official quoted on Channel 12, one of the TV stations here, saying that this was 4 days, the start of 4 days of extensive strikes against the Iranians, and that following that, Iran would not look the same.
Iran would not look the same. The Iranian authorities had been preparing for strikes like this one. What do you know about the impact in Iran and any possible reaction from the Iranian government?
Well, we've seen pictures coming out of the Iranian capital, Tehran, showing smoke rising in the air in 2 separate areas, I believe. We don't know what the target was. And look, we have been anticipating this. We've seen the biggest build-up of military hardware in the Middle East by the Americans since the Iraq war in 2003. Now, the question is this some sort of limited strike to continue to put pressure on the Iranians to make concessions in those ongoing negotiations with the United States over their nuclear program, or could it be the start of something bigger than that? And the fear in the region, the fear here, the fear in Iran especially, would be that this could be the start of another war in the Middle East.
What was the impact of the previous short-lived conflicts we saw between Israel, the US and Iran last year? How did it impact the region and Israel itself?
Well, look, we had that 12-day war last year, and during that we had ballistic missiles being fired towards Israel, causing damage, limited, if any, casualties. And we can expect, I think, a retaliation from the Iranians if we go by what's happened in the past. Now, that may be targeting Israel. That is clearly something that the authorities here are anticipating, giving those warnings that we all got on our phones here this morning, saying that a response from the Iranians was likely, or it could be that Iran targets US facilities that they have in Syria, in Iraq, in the Gulf. We just don't know at the moment.
We're also hearing from Iranian media that blasts have been heard in Iran's Isfahan city. Of course, this is a city with important military infrastructure there as well. So just talk us through, at the moment, the impact, the potential impact of these strikes.
Well, we don't know what the Israelis and possibly the Americans were going after. Now, you'll remember last year when we had that 12-day war, we had President Trump and the White House saying that they had obliterated Iran's nuclear program. Well, that clearly isn't the case. And as your previous guest was saying, to what point when will we get to the point where the Israelis in particular feel that they have finished the job? Now, we were being told last year by the Americans that they'd finished the job, that they'd set it back decades, that nuclear program. 6-7 months on, that clearly isn't the case. And the frustration by the Israelis has continued to build, and they have been pressuring the Americans to carry out some sort of strike. It looks like it's the Israelis who've gone first, who've pulled the trigger first, but according to Israeli media, with the American backing.
We've heard from the Israeli authorities saying that a state of emergency is now in place as it prepares for potential Iranian strikes. Just give us a sense of the mood there in Jerusalem following this news.
Well, people are worried. I was just seeing the ambulance service here saying that they were putting special measures in place across the country. I've seen reports that one of the major hospitals, the medical facilities in Tel Aviv, has initiated a system where it even lowers some of its wards to make them safer, bringing them further underground. So they are expecting a retaliation, and that could mean casualties. Iran's missile program has been seriously diminished in that previous conflict last year, but it still has hundreds, thousands of ballistic missiles with the possibility of reaching all parts of Israel and causing major damage.
Throughout the last few weeks, as the US and Iran have carried out talks, indirect talks, but nevertheless talks in Oman and in Geneva there, and in Geneva as well, what have the Iranian authorities been saying about any potential strike and how they would respond?
Well, they have said that they will respond to any action by the Israelis or the Americans. As I say, the question is whether this is another way of ratcheting up the pressure on the Iranians. Now, we understand that negotiations on technical matters were due to continue, I think, in Vienna this week between the Iranians and the United States. We've also got the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Well, he's due in Israel on Monday and Tuesday to have discussions with the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. So at the same time as we've got this military action, we were being told that the diplomatic path was continuing, with negotiations expected to continue. Now, whether that will still be the case after what appears to have happened this morning, well, we're just going to have to wait and see.
And John, before we let you go, we have this coming in from the Reuters news agency. A US official saying US strikes against Iran are being launched by air and by sea, pointing to that huge military buildup that we've seen there in the region.
Yeah, and look, as I say, we've been anticipating this for weeks now. I was last here at the start of January, and we were anticipating action by the Israelis, by the Americans then. Now, it has taken several weeks for the Americans to get their military hardware in place. They've been shifting it from around the world to the region. We've got two aircraft carrier groups here from the United States in the region. Fighter jets have been relocating to this part of the world. So it has been building up. America clearly feels it is now ready. To what extent the Americans were directly involved in this initial preemptive strike, and to what extent they're going to be involved over the coming days, well, we're going to have to wait and see. And it's going to be interesting in the coming hours to hear what President Trump has to say. He's often awake late into the night, and I can imagine we might get some sort of statement from him soon.
John, thank you. That's our correspondent, John Donnison in Jerusalem there.